In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God. We celebrate today the feast of the entrance of the Most Holy Theotokos into the temple. And there's a common way of talking about the different feasts of the church, the 12 great feasts, and saying that some of them are scriptural feasts. Some of them we find their origin in the Bible, and others are from outside of that they belong only to holy tradition, are therefore somehow unscriptural. And if we were to draw up such a ledger, as the saying goes, this one is clearly in the unscriptural category, for the events that we celebrate are not recorded in the New Testament. But to speak thus is to miss the very import of this feast. This feast is profoundly scriptural. This feast points us to the very heart of the whole story of God told in the Scriptures. The motif of the temple isn't simply something which is an occasional symbol that is called forth in that story, nor is it a recurring motif only. It is rather the very foundation of that story itself. From one end of the canvas of the narrative of God to the other, it is the temple that we find. And we so often miss this. I think we have come to think of the temple purely in negative terms. We even come to reading the Gospels in this way. The temple becomes some kind of, perhaps no longer relevant, outdated form of worship, of sacrifice. It's primitive. And we want to get away from it into something more purely spiritual. Or perhaps we think of it as being associated with a sort of collaborative set of authorities in the first century in Jerusalem. Something to do with the Roman occupation and the Jews who collaborated with them. A place where there's exploitation. And sure doesn't the Lord enter in and overturn the tables of the money changers, clearly opposing that institution. Or we think of it in strictly ritualistic terms as simply some sort of legalistic enterprise, soon to be superseded by something which represents grace and truth as opposed to mere law and obedience. But all of these ways of thinking about it are wrong. All of these distract us from the centrality of the temple in the Gospels, let alone in the whole of the scriptural story. And this feast, as I say, points us back at that as the central story of God. And in some ways, the very origins of this feast are recorded in the New Testament. We heard last night when the gospel reading at Matins was the gospel reading we're given on the Marian feast. It's the story of how Mary, after the Annunciation to her by the Archangel Gabriel, goes where? She goes to her cousin Elizabeth, and she announces the good news, and they celebrate together. But there's a line there that's really important and is perhaps easily overlooked. It says that in doing so, she enters the house of Zacharias. She enters the house of Zacharias. What is the house of Zacharias? Zacharias, a priest, we know from the Gospel of Luke. A high priest even, we know from early church tradition. To enter the house of Zacharias is to enter the temple. To enter the house of Zacharias is to enter the house of Israel. And what is the temple? Why is it, I say, it's the fundamental story from beginning to end of the narrative of Scripture. And why have this feast of entering into that temple? The temple, from Genesis to Revelation, is the very foundation of creation. If you pay close attention to the first chapters of Genesis, you will see that God creates the heaven and the earth precisely as a temple. It's how he sets it up, heaven and earth together, as a place for his image to be set amidst the decoration of a beautiful temple, appointed with all the glory of his life shared with the world. Heaven and earth come together, and in that place, constructed with a firmament above and the ground beneath, and all of that beauty and glory of a place of worship. And in the midst of it, as in any temple, the image of the God is placed, the human being. And God rests in that temple, and God dwells with his people in that temple. And as we see at the very end of the Scriptures, in the book of the Revelation, recorded by John the Evangelist, heaven and earth come together in the fullness and the fulfillment of all creation. A new heaven and a new earth, described exactly as the temple was in the Old Covenant. And there, that temple will last forever. That temple will be unto the ages of ages. And God will dwell with his people. Temple at the beginning, temple at the end, temple of creation, temple of new creation. And in the midst of that, the whole story of how that unfolds when, exiled from that place, human beings are called to return slowly, by measures, by stages. First hints of that when God calls a people into existence by calling a nomad, Abraham, who has no home, but calling his family in order to be a place where God can dwell amidst the people of creation. And there are hints here and there, again and again, of what that will look like. Abraham's grandson, Jacob, who takes the name Israel, who lies down on a rock in the wilderness and has a vision of the temple of God and of angels ascending and descending. And he says, truly, this is the house of God, and is thus named Israel. And from that comes a people delivered from Egypt into the wilderness, where God calls them to establish a tabernacle. We heard this as one of the readings at the vigil last night. And in that tabernacle, God's own glory, his own divine presence would come and would descend as a cloud and would dwell amidst the people. The tabernacle in the wilderness being a kind of working model of all of creation. Not simply a place for ritual, not simply a place of sacrifice, not simply a place of escape from the world, but rather the working model of what creation is supposed to be, where heaven and earth come together and God dwells. That was what creation was for. That is what the new creation will be. And amidst that people that God called, that's what begins to take shape in that tabernacle in the wilderness. And as we go forward with the story, Solomon, who builds a house of stone, reluctantly God gives in to this, because in some senses that tabernacle is the superior working model of creation, more utterly dependent on God himself. There's always a temptation when we build houses of stone for God that we somehow limit him, that we somehow bring him into being more like the gods of the surrounding cultures and nations, which are houses built of stone. But nevertheless, here too, God's glory descends. That divine glory, which the rabbis will later call God's Shekinah, comes and dwells in that first temple in Jerusalem. And that too becomes that working model, that microcosm of all of creation. And God dwells amidst his people, not, again, as a place separate from the rest of the world, but a light to the whole world, as a sign, as a symbol for that which is yet to become and to be revealed to all. And then we come, of course, to the destruction of that temple, the exile of the people of Israel, and then the calling back of that people to Zion and to the construction of a new temple. A temple that never is said to have God's divine presence, his Shekinah, but nevertheless is a foretaste of what is yet to come. A sign that God will yet fulfill his promises. The people somehow remain in exile as long as that presence is not there, and they're well aware of it. And it's in this time that the expectation is ratcheted up, that hope in God's fulfillment of his promises reaches a fever pitch, and the Messianic age is anticipated. And it's into the midst of this that a young girl is appointed to enter into that temple, into that house of Zacharias, enter into that place in order that those promises might come to their fulfillment. And what does the New Testament say? On every page it's about that temple coming to its fulfillment. No less so, of course, than in the Gospel of John, which reprises the story of Genesis. In the beginning, John begins his Gospel. And what is that story? It's the story of God himself who visits his people. And what does John say? The Word became flesh and dwelt in our midst. The word here means tabernacled in our midst. Jesus himself, who takes up that role of bringing heaven and earth together, of being the place where God's divine presence dwells fully in the midst of his people. And again, this is hammered home through every page of the New Testament. This is what God is doing. The temple in Jerusalem was merely a foretaste of what God's true purposes are, which are to establish a living and permanent temple and presence. Because that remains God's purpose, not to be apart from his creation, not to be that kind of deistic God or Epicurean God in a two-story universe away from his people. God, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who takes flesh in Jesus Christ, is a God who desires that he dwell amidst his creation. That's what this temple, foundation to the whole story of God, is about. God who comes and joining heaven and earth dwells forever in our midst, and who joins us to that same reality. That's what this feast is all about. And as our attention is brought back again to this God, not to another God, the God that we possibly live most of our lives by, a God who is alienated from our very life, a God who takes no interest in this world. And we imagine that possibly all we need to do is somehow believe in some sort of ideology, and we'll be taken away from this into some sort of spiritual reality. Most Christians probably live as functional Epicureans in that regard. Heaven far away, God who dwells there. We left here for some time, but eventually we'll be taken to heaven, won't we? And we'll dwell with God in heaven. Far from it. The temple story of God is a story where heaven and earth come together, where God dwells here and renews this cosmos, renews this creation, renews this life and the stuff of the world we live every day. And how different our life would be if we understood and knew and lived that. How different would it be if we understood, as St. Paul says over and over again in his epistles, that we are being made into that temple, that the chief cornerstone is Jesus Christ, who by his death and resurrection unites heaven and earth. St. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 1, that division is broken. They are united now and forever. And if we understand that, and we know how we, on the foundation of that cornerstone and the foundation of the apostles, are being knit together into this temple, how different our life would be. how different we would understand the world and people in all of creation around us. That is where God desires to dwell. And he's made us already those who bear that life into the world. This entrance of the Theotokos into the temple is our own entrance also into that temple reality, our own calling to be those who bring that life, that glory of God that has been shared with us, that tabernacled in our midst, that we have come to know by the eyes of faith and by our rebirth into new creation. That's what this is all about. And if we live that way, how different the world around us will look, and how different it will be when we touch it, when we go forth from this place. The Christian life is not one of escape from this world, but of a total and transformation of that world into the world of the new creation. And it will be the case that God will dwell all in that new heaven and new earth. The renewed heaven and renewed earth will be revealed. And those of us who have entered into that temple will see that glory of God shared amongst all of creation and with every person. But we are called to live that here and now. So as we celebrate this feast, let us remember that temple story. Let us remember that we are made into that temple and that God dwells here and now amidst his creation.